AITA for locking my wife's family out of my late father's cabin before their wedding? I'm Tyler, 40, and I had been married to Brooke for 8 years when her family turned my late father's cabin into the center of a fight I never wanted. The cabin was not the kind of place anybody would mistake for a luxury wedding venue. The porch leaned just enough that a marble would roll toward the steps. The screen door swelled in humid weather and had to be lifted slightly before it would latch. Half the coffee mugs in the cabinet still had the logo from my Dad Ray's fishing club, and there was a shallow notch in the porch railing where he used to rest the handle of his tackle box. After he died, Brooke helped me clean the place out. That mattered to me more than I ever really explained. I had spent 2 straight days moving through the cabin like I was sorting someone else's life. Brooke didn't rush me. She didn't throw out my dad's old things just because they looked worn. She sat on the porch with me for most of one afternoon while I held an old brass key fob he had carried for years. It had a little enamel fish on it, chipped near the tail. She understood, or at least I thought she did. That was part of why I let her family use the cabin from time to time. When Brooke's dad, Dale, needed a quiet weekend after a rough stretch of medical treatment, I told them to take it. When her mother, Sharon, wanted to have a small birthday lunch there, I said yes on the condition that it stayed small. Connor, Brooke's younger brother, once borrowed my dad's old fishing boat for a family trip. None of those things were huge by themselves, but every favor left something behind. After Sharon's birthday, I drove up to find 3 garbage bags still sitting by the porch because nobody wanted to fit them in their car. One folding chair had a cracked leg. Somebody had left wet towels in the bathroom until they smelled sour. Another weekend, the utility bill jumped because people had left the window units running with the windows open. Every time I brought it up, Brooke had some version of the same answer. They're loud, but they mean well. I wanted that to be true because the alternative was admitting her family had started confusing access with ownership. I also had a bad habit of fixing the aftermath myself. I would complain, replace whatever was broken, clean up what was left, and move on. I told myself I was protecting my marriage from pointless fights. What I was really doing was teaching people that my limits came with no consequences. The wedding issue started about 5 months before Connor was supposed to marry Grace. Connor and Sharon brought it up at our house, acting like they were pitching me something modest. Connor said, "We've been looking at venues, but Grace really wants something personal. We thought maybe the cabin." I didn't immediately say no. That's important because for the rest of this mess, Sharon acted like I had slammed the door in their faces from the first sentence. I asked how many people. Connor said small. Family. Maybe a few friends. Sharon added, intimate. I had learned enough by then to ask for an actual number. Connor shrugged. 20, 25. That sounded manageable. The cabin has a clearing near the water and enough parking for a handful of cars if people are sensible. So I said I would consider a small ceremony or afternoon gathering, with very specific limits. Small means 25 people, I told them. No vendor trucks. No overnight guests. No RVs. No tents bigger than a normal shade canopy. Nobody parks on the septic field. Nobody blocks the access road. And this is not a whole wedding weekend. Sharon smiled like I had just read rules at a public pool. It's one day, Tyler. That's why these rules shouldn't be hard. Connor asked about music. I said a speaker was fine. No rented sound system. No generator. No stage. Then he asked whether a caterer could drop things off. I said maybe, depending on the vehicle, but nobody was bringing a box truck through the gate without me knowing about it. I remember Brooke sitting on the arm of the couch, looking increasingly uncomfortable as I listed things. After her family left, she told me I had made it sound like I was granting a permit for a construction project. I was trying to keep it from becoming one, I said. She rubbed her forehead. Connor finally has something good happening. Can you not make this harder than it needs to be? I said yes. You said yes with a rule book. I said yes to 25 people at a cabin with a septic system designed for a small family. That's not a rule book. That's reality. She didn't argue after that, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied. Over the next few weeks, the language changed. Sharon stopped saying Tyler's cabin. She started calling it the family lake place. The first time I corrected her, she waved me off. You know what I mean. I didn't know what she meant. That was the problem. Then Connor texted asking for the gate code because the vendor wanted to measure the entrance. I wrote back, what vendor? He didn't answer for almost 2 hours. Then he said Grace was checking some decor options and it was nothing serious. I told him nobody was getting the gate code to inspect my property without me there. He reacted with a thumbs up. A week later, Brooke asked me where I kept the cabin deed and insurance paperwork. She tried to make it sound casual. Just so I know, in case something ever happens. I looked at her and said, something like what? Nothing. I'm your wife. I should know where important stuff is. That wasn't an unreasonable statement by itself. We had been married 8 years. She knew where most of our documents were. I told her the deed was in the fireproof box with other property records, and the insurance information was in my email. She nodded and changed the subject. A couple of weeks after that, a save-the-date from Connor and Grace arrived in the mail. Under their names and the date, the location read, the lake house. Not ceremony details to follow. Not private family gathering. The lake house, as if that were the established name of a venue. I carried the card into the kitchen and put it on the counter in front of Brooke. What is this? She looked at it for half a second too long. The save-the-date. I can read. Why does it list the cabin as a venue? Because that's where they're hoping to have it. Hoping. Tyler. No, don't Tyler me. We agreed on 25 people. A save-the-date goes to everybody invited. She folded her arms. They haven't finalized the guest list. That answer bought her maybe 10 days. Then I saw an email in our shared household account. The subject line mentioned rental chairs. I opened it because I thought maybe it was spam or a duplicate charge. It was a rental estimate for 84 chairs. I called Brooke into the room. She barely looked at the screen before saying, those are for Grace's shower. 84 chairs for a shower? She has a big family. Where is the shower? I don't know. Ask Grace. It was too quick. Too irritated. I didn't push right then because I didn't want every interaction with my wife to become an interrogation. That was another mistake. A few days later, one of Brooke's cousins texted me out of nowhere. Hey, Tyler, really appreciate you hosting everybody. We're trying to figure out if we should bring sleeping bags for the cabin or just tent by the water. Is there enough room for 2 small RVs too? I stared at that message for a while before replying. What weekend are you talking about? He sent back 3 question marks, then the wedding date. That was when I stopped telling myself this was just bad communication. I showed Brooke the text that night. She sat at the edge of the bed and exhaled through her nose. Mom probably got ahead of herself. Your mom told people they can sleep at my cabin. I'll talk to her. And Connor. I'll talk to Connor too. And Grace. Why are you dragging Grace into it? Because it's her wedding. Brooke stood up. You keep saying it's one day like you're being generous, and then you act like every small adjustment is some kind of personal attack. You keep saying it's one day. They keep planning like it's a festival. That landed badly. She slept with her back to me that night. I should probably explain something about Brooke's family dynamic. Sharon wasn't a monster. She was the kind of person who could make a request sound like a moral test. If you helped, you were family. If you hesitated, you were keeping score. If you said no, she wanted to know when you had become so cold. Brooke had spent most of her life managing that pressure. She was the one who remembered birthdays, smoothed over arguments, and told Connor when to apologize before Sharon exploded. I knew that about her. I had sympathy for it. For years, I had mistaken that sympathy for a reason to let her family walk farther into our decisions than I was comfortable with. The public blow-up happened at Sharon and Dale's house about 2 months before the wedding. It was supposed to be a normal dinner. Grace was there, along with Connor, Brooke, Mia, who is Brooke's cousin, and a few other relatives. Someone asked Grace how planning was going. She said, better now that the venue problem is solved. I looked at Brooke. Brooke looked at her plate. I asked Grace what she meant. She gave me a nervous smile. The cabin? Connor said you were okay with the bigger guest count as long as people stayed mostly outside. I said no, I'm not okay with a bigger guest count. I agreed to 25 people. No overnight guests. No RVs. No large vendors. The table got very still. Connor put his fork down. Come on, man. We've already sent things out. That wasn't my decision. Sharon gave a little laugh. There it is. The property speech. I said, it's not a speech. It's my answer. She leaned back and looked around the table like she had an audience. It's just sitting there most of the time. Stop acting like a hall monitor with keys. A couple of people laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Connor said, it's not like you built the place yourself. That one got to me. I had been trying to keep my voice level, but I looked straight at him and said, "No, my father did a lot of the work, and unlike you, he understood that wanting something doesn't make it yours." Connor's face changed. Grace said, "Okay, that was unnecessary." She was right. I was angry at Connor, but bringing up my dad like that was meant to cut him. I knew it as soon as I said it. I apologized to Grace, not to Connor. Then Sharon said, "You're making this about property instead of love." I answered, "You're making love conditional on whether I hand you property." Brooke finally spoke. "Can we not do this here?" I looked at her. "Where would you like to do it?" Because apparently the planning has been happening everywhere except with me. That was the part Brooke remembered later. She said I embarrassed her in front of her family. I said nothing about how she had sat there while they laughed at me. On the drive home, we barely spoke. Finally, Brooke said, "You made Connor look like an idiot. He told his fiancée I approved something I didn't approve. He thought I had it handled." I turned my head toward her. "What does that mean?" She stared out the passenger window. "It means I told them I would talk to you. You didn't. I have been talking to you for weeks." "No, you've been telling me to loosen up. That's different." She said nothing after that. The call that changed everything came 4 days later. I was at home when an event rental company called my cell. The woman on the phone introduced herself and said she needed to confirm the width of the driveway gate and the earliest setup time for delivery. I told her she had the wrong number. She read back my full legal name and the cabin address. Then she said, "We have you listed as the property owner." I sat down. "What exactly are you delivering?" "Tables, 84 chairs, 2 canopy structures, lighting stands, and some service equipment. The caterer asked whether the exterior outlets are on separate circuits, so we're coordinating arrival." I said, "There is no event approved at that property." There was a pause. She said, carefully, "We have an owner authorization form." "Signed by who?" "By you." I asked her to email me a copy while we were on the phone. When it arrived, I opened it on my laptop. My name was typed in the owner field. My full legal name, not the shortened version almost everyone used. The signature underneath was supposed to be mine. It was a close copy, the kind someone could make after seeing it enough times. The first initial leaned wrong. The last letters were too careful. I signed my name fast and messy. This looked like somebody drawing it. I asked the woman where they got the form. She said it had been returned through the wedding coordinator email they had on file. I asked for the email address. It was an address Grace and Connor were using for wedding planning, but the actual message forwarding the signed document had Brooke's name in the sender line. I thanked the vendor for sending it and told her in writing that I had not signed the form and did not authorize an event. Then I sat at the kitchen table for about 15 minutes, doing nothing. I didn't yell. I didn't call Sharon. I didn't call Connor. I waited for Brooke to get home. She walked in carrying groceries and stopped when she saw the printed authorization on the table. Her eyes moved from the page to me. I said, "Did you sign this?" She put the grocery bag down very slowly. "Tyler, did you sign my name?" I handled it. That answer is burned into my memory more clearly than the argument that followed. I said, "Handled what exactly?" She pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. They needed proof that the property owner knew about the event. It was getting ridiculous. Every vendor wanted something different. "So you signed my name." I didn't think of it like that. "What did you think the signature line was for?" She flinched. "I thought you were going to come around." That is not an answer. I was trying to help my brother. "You used my legal name to tell a business I approved something I explicitly did not approve." Her face tightened. "You're making it sound criminal." "I'm describing what you did." She said they were already too far into the planning. Deposits had been paid. Guests had made plans. Grace's parents had told people about the lake wedding. Sharon was panicking about costs. I said, "None of those things gave you permission." Brooke's eyes filled, but she was still defensive. "I thought once the day was over, we could fix us." That sentence did more damage than almost anything else. Not because she meant to be cruel. Because she had actually decided that my consent was an obstacle to be managed until after everyone got what they wanted. I asked her whether Connor knew the signature wasn't mine. She said, "He knew I was handling the paperwork." That wasn't a yes or no. I asked whether Sharon knew. Brooke said, "Mom knew you were being difficult." Again, not a yes or no. I stopped asking for confessions she was determined to give in pieces. The next day, another piece landed in my lap without me looking for it. Mia's husband sent me a message asking whether the $150 late contribution covered both nights or whether families with RVs needed to send more. I called him. He sounded confused when I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. He forwarded me the message they had received with their RSVP information. It said that because the family lake property was being used instead of a commercial venue, adult guests staying for the weekend were being asked to contribute $150 toward maintenance, utilities, cleanup, and property use. The message said the contribution would help Tyler with the costs of opening the place for everyone. I hadn't received $1. I asked how people were paying. Some had sent money through Zelle, some through Venmo to Connor. A few older relatives had mailed checks to Sharon. I called Mia directly because I trusted her to answer a simple question without turning it into a loyalty test. She said she and her husband had already sent $300. To Connor, I asked. Yes, I thought you knew. I didn't. There was a long pause. Then she said, Tyler, what exactly did you approve? I told her the truth. 25 people. No overnight guests. No large vendors. No RVs. No big tents. She went quiet again. Finally, she said, that is not what we were told. I spent the next several days doing something I should have done much earlier, separating facts from family arguments. I saved the messages about RVs. I saved the chair invoice. I saved the save the date. I asked the rental company for a clean copy of the owner authorization and the email trail that delivered it. I contacted the caterer and the canopy company and told them, in writing, that I owned the property and had not authorized access. I didn't demand that they cancel Connor's contracts. That was between them and whoever hired them. I told them only that they could not enter my land or set up there. One vendor asked whether this was some kind of family dispute. I said, yes, but your access issue is not. You do not have owner permission. I also called the cabin's insurance carrier because I wanted to know whether 80-plus guests, commercial catering, tents, and overnight stays created problems. The answer was exactly what I expected. The policy wasn't written for someone to run an event venue out of the property. I changed the gate code. Then I collected the spare physical key that Brooke's parents had from an earlier visit. Dale returned it without argument. Sharon called Brooke afterward and said I was treating them like thieves. I installed a basic camera pointed at the gate, not inside the cabin or anywhere guests would expect privacy, because at that point I no longer trusted anyone to respect a locked gate simply because it was locked. I put up a simple notice, private property, no event access, owner authorization required. Brooke saw the notice in a photo on my phone and said, "You're really doing this?" I said yes. 2 months before the wedding. You forged my approval 2 months before the wedding. She hated that word. Every time I used forged, she corrected me. I signed it because you were refusing to be reasonable. That is forging. I was not trying to steal from you. You don't have to steal a cabin to violate my trust. She started sleeping in the guest room. Meanwhile, Sharon began calling relatives and telling them I had suddenly withdrawn the venue because I wanted to punish Connor. That version spread fast. I got messages from people I barely knew asking me to think about Grace. One uncle wrote, "Whatever issue you have with Sharon, don't ruin 2 young people's wedding over it." Another relative said, "You can be right and still be cruel." That one bothered me because, in a narrow sense, it was true. Grace had made plans based on what people she trusted told her. Vendors had reserved a date. Guests had booked travel. If I shut the property down, innocent people would be inconvenienced. I considered allowing a reduced version to go forward. For about one evening, I seriously thought about it. Then I realized I would be rewarding the exact strategy that had put me there. Make the lie expensive enough, public enough, and close enough to the date that I would feel morally obligated to surrender. That was the trap. Brooke asked me to at least let the ceremony happen and refuse only the overnight part. I said I would consider a 25-person ceremony under the original conditions if every vendor arrangement that required owner authorization was canceled and every guest was told the truth. She stared at me. "You know Mom will never agree to that." "Then Mom is choosing the bigger wedding over the cabin. You're forcing everyone to humiliate themselves." "No, I'm refusing to keep their story intact." That was the point when Brooke stopped asking me to compromise and started accusing me of wanting revenge. Maybe part of me did. I would be lying if I said there was no satisfaction in changing that gate code after being called a hall monitor with keys. But I also knew that if I made decisions purely from anger, I would regret them. So I kept everything in writing. I didn't damage equipment. I didn't call guests to stir things up. I didn't threaten anyone. I told vendors one fact. There was no owner consent for their access. Sharon eventually announced a planning dinner about 3 weeks before the wedding. Brooke told me I needed to come. I said I didn't see the point. She said, "Mom wants to clear the air." I almost laughed. Sharon didn't clear air. Sharon assigned blame until everyone was tired enough to accept it. Still, I went, because by then relatives had been pulled into the argument and Grace was still operating with incomplete information. If Sharon wanted an audience, I decided the audience could hear the full version. The dinner started stiffly. Grace looked exhausted. Connor looked angry before I had even sat down. Mia barely spoke. Sharon opened by saying, "I asked everyone here because this has gone far enough." I said nothing. She continued, "Tyler has decided to turn a family wedding into a property dispute, and I think we need to stop attacking each other and find a solution." That wording was impressive even for her. Connor said, "The solution is easy. Let the wedding happen. We deal with the rest afterward." Dale nodded. "That's what I've been saying. No need to turn this into a legal thing." I asked, "Who turned it into a legal thing?" Sharon sighed. "There. That tone." I took a single sheet of paper from the envelope I had brought and slid it across the table toward Grace. It was the owner authorization form. I said, "Did you see this before today?" Grace picked it up. Her eyes moved across the page. "No." Connor said, "Why does that matter?" I looked at him. "Because that is not my signature." Brooke closed her eyes. Mia leaned forward. Grace looked at Brooke. "Who signed this?" Brooke said, "I filled out some paperwork because Tyler was making everything impossible." Mia asked, "Did he actually sign this?" Brooke didn't answer. Mia asked again, slower. "Brooke, did Tyler sign this?" "No." That was the first clean admission I had heard. Connor immediately said, "Okay, but Brooke is his wife. She thought she had permission." I pulled out the email from the rental company confirming the form had been submitted under my name. Then the written notice I had sent them revoking any supposed permission. Then the caterer's reply acknowledging they would not enter the property without direct owner authorization. Sharon said, "This is exactly what I mean. You came prepared to prosecute your own family." I said, "I came prepared because my name is on contracts I didn't sign." Grace was still holding the authorization form. She asked Connor, "Did you know he hadn't approved this?" Connor said, "I knew there was an argument about numbers." "That isn't what I asked." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought Brooke had worked it out." I said, "Worked it out with who?" Connor snapped. "Why do you need to be such an ass about every word?" "Because every vague word in this situation has cost somebody money." That brought me to the second envelope. I put a printout of the Lake Weekend contribution message on the table. Mia's expression changed immediately because she recognized it. Grace read it. Then she looked up at Connor. "What is this?" Connor said, "That was just to help cover costs." "Whose costs?" "Wedding costs. Cleanup. Whatever." Grace pointed at the page. "It says the money is helping Tyler open the property." Connor's face went red. Sharon jumped in. "Nobody was profiting. Venues charged thousands. We were trying to keep things fair." I said, "How much did you collect?" Sharon said, "That is none of your business." Mia actually laughed once, not because anything was funny. She said, "You used his property to collect it. I think it's his business." That was the moment her position changed. Before that, Mia had been one of the people telling me I was too rigid. After seeing the paperwork and the contribution message side by side, she stopped treating it like a personality conflict. Grace looked at her and asked, "You paid this?" Mia nodded. $300 for me and Mark. Grace looked back at Connor. "How many people paid?" He said he didn't know. Sharon said she had the list. Nobody missed what that meant. Dale finally spoke. "Look, mistakes were made. We can sort the money after the wedding." I said no. Sharon turned on me. "What do you want, Tyler? An apology in front of everybody? Do you want Brooke to beg? Do you want Connor's wedding canceled so you can prove you own a cabin?" I felt Brooke looking at me. For years, that look would have made me soften. Not because she was manipulative, but because I hated being the reason she was stuck between two sides. That night, I finally understood that she wasn't between two sides anymore. She had chosen one and used my name to make the other side disappear. I said, "You didn't plan a wedding at my cabin. You planned it on my silence." Sharon shook her head. "Oh, please." I pointed to the paperwork. "You told vendors I agreed. You told guests the cabin was family property. You collected money in my name. Brooke signed my name because all of you assumed that once the deposits were paid and people were invited, I would be too embarrassed to stop you." Connor said, "Because a normal person would let one day go and deal with it later." I looked at him. "That is why this went this far. You thought my only options were to give you what you wanted or be the villain." Grace said quietly, "What happens now?" I answered her, not Connor. "The cabin is not available for the wedding. The gate code has been changed. The vendors have been notified that they do not have permission to enter. The old spare key has been returned. There is a notice on the gate." Sharon started crying. Not loud sobbing, angry tears. She said, "You are ruining your brother's wedding over a technicality." "He is not my brother," I said. The words came out colder than I intended. Brooke recoiled. I corrected myself. "He is my brother-in-law, and I have helped him plenty. But he does not become my brother by having a claim on my father's property." Connor pushed his chair back. "This is insane." I said, "I am not ruining your wedding. I am refusing to host the lie you built it on." Grace covered her mouth with one hand and stared at the table. That was the part one felt worst about. She hadn't signed my name. She hadn't called the cabin family property. As far as I could tell, she had believed Connor when he said Brooke had gotten my approval. But she was still the one watching her wedding plan collapse in real time. I told her I was sorry she had been lied to. The next week was chaos, though most of it didn't involve me directly. Connor and Grace scrambled for another location. A smaller hall had a cancellation and could take them, but not with the same setup. Some rental items had to be cut. The large canopies were unnecessary. The caterer could still serve there, but their schedule and equipment changed. Connor lost part of at least one deposit because the original site plan had been part of the rental agreement. Sharon told everyone I had intentionally waited until the last minute. That wasn't true, but it was close enough to sting. I had warned them repeatedly about the limits. Once I learned my name had been used, I acted quickly. Still, I also had months of signs that the plan was expanding, and I had kept hoping Brooke would fix it rather than forcing a direct confrontation. I had let my discomfort with conflict become delay. The wedding weekend arrived. By then, everyone directly involved had been told the cabin was unavailable. That didn't stop some of them. The camera at the gate showed several cars arriving that morning, including a rental truck carrying chairs. Behind it was an SUV carrying a decorative sign that read "Welcome to the family property." A catering van arrived a few minutes later, but its driver never tried to enter after calling the contact number and confirming the site had no owner access. They stopped at the locked gate. One person got out and tried the old code twice. Another walked up to the notice and read it. The rental truck driver called the number on his paperwork, then left. He did exactly what his company had told me he would do if there was no owner access. A few relatives stayed parked there long enough to call Sharon and Connor. I saw the "Welcome to the family property" sign later in a picture Mia sent me. That detail would have been funny if the whole situation hadn't felt so ugly. Nobody broke the gate. Nobody forced entry. The people who showed up eventually turned around and went to the hall. The wedding still happened. Grace chose not to cancel. From what Brooke told me later, the ceremony was smaller and simpler than Grace had planned. Some guests were irritated. A few left early. Sharon spent a lot of the day telling people that the venue change was a family emergency. But there was a second problem she couldn't explain away so easily. People wanted their $150 back. Once Mia started asking directly where her $300 had gone, other relatives did too. Connor and Sharon had to account for the money. Some of it had apparently been used toward rentals and other wedding expenses. Some was still sitting in the accounts where it had been collected. They eventually refunded the contributions, though not all at once. I never received any of it, and made sure everyone who contacted me knew that. Grace confronted Connor before the wedding about the money and the signature situation. She still married him, which surprised some people. But according to Brooke, Grace made it clear that the refunds had to happen and that she would not be covering for him with relatives. She also asked Connor, in front of Brooke, whether he had known I said no before Brooke signed the form. Connor kept insisting he thought Brooke would get me there. That may have been true. It didn't make him innocent. He knew there was no clear yes. He simply believed somebody else would absorb the problem for him. The wedding being over did not fix my marriage. Brooke came home afterward exhausted and angry. She said the entire day people had looked at her like she was the reason everything changed. I said, "You were part of the reason." She said, "You wanted me humiliated. I wanted the truth known. In front of everyone. They were brought in to pressure me in front of everyone. So you had to destroy me back?" That question stopped me, because I did understand why it felt that way to her. I had not gone to that dinner intending to protect her dignity. I had gone prepared to make the lie impossible to maintain. Those are not exactly the same thing. I told her that. I also told her I was not going to apologize for refusing to hide what she had done. She cried and said, "I was trying to help." I said, "You were trying to help them. You decided I was the person who could be harmed because I would still be here afterward." She had no answer. For several nights we slept in separate rooms. Then I left for a few days because being under the same roof had turned into repeating the same argument in different words. During that time, I went to the cabin once. I expected it to calm me down. It didn't. The porch looked the same. The screen door still stuck. My dad's mugs were still in the cabinet. But for a while, the place felt contaminated by the whole mess. I could look at the clearing and picture 84 chairs where my father used to set out a folding stool and clean fish. That made me angrier than I wanted to be. When I came back, Brooke asked what it would take for me to stay married. I told her I didn't know if we would stay married. That was the first time either of us said it plainly. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and nodded like she had been expecting the word. I gave her conditions for even trying. Counseling, not just one appointment, so she could say she went. Complete transparency about what she had signed or sent using my name. A written apology to every vendor who had been given false owner approval. An apology to the relatives who had been told their late contribution was going to me. And from then on, nobody in her family would use the cabin unless I personally agreed in writing. No implied permission. No, Brooke said it was fine. No spare keys floating around. Brooke said the writing requirements sounded cold. I said, so did finding my signature on a form. She winced, and I regretted the jab even though I didn't take it back. This is the part where some people in her family decided I was controlling. Sharon refused to speak to me for a while. When she did, she said I had turned marriage into a contract. I told her, "You turned my name into one first." Dale mostly stayed out of it after the wedding. I think the guest money finally broke his ability to call the whole thing a misunderstanding. Mia apologized to me for initially assuming I was being difficult. I told her she didn't need to take my side in everything. I just needed people to stop pretending the signature and the money were normal family behavior. She said they weren't. That was enough. Brooke started counseling with me. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single session where she suddenly understood everything. At first, she kept describing what she had done as taking care of the paperwork. Our counselor asked her why she avoided the words signed his name. She got angry. Then she got quiet. Eventually, she admitted she had known I would say no if she asked directly. That mattered. Pressure from Sharon and Connor had been real, but pressure wasn't the same as force. Brooke had made a choice because disappointing them felt worse in the moment than betraying me. She also wrote the letters. I read the one she sent to the rental company because my name had been involved. It didn't blame me. It didn't call the situation a misunderstanding. She wrote that she had submitted owner authorization without my consent and that the vendor had acted in good faith based on information she provided. That was the first apology that felt like responsibility instead of regret. We didn't immediately go back to normal. We agreed on a trial separation for several weeks while continuing counseling, because neither of us trusted ourselves to rebuild anything while repeating the same fight every night. I didn't want normal anymore, because our old normal included me swallowing things until somebody finally went too far. Even after we began spending more time together again, we stayed emotionally separated for a while. There were days I thought we were rebuilding, and others when I looked at her and remembered that she had seen the cabin at my worst after my father died, and still convinced herself years later that my attachment to it could be overridden if enough people were counting on her. That loss was bigger than the wedding. I had always believed Brooke was the one person in her family who understood why the cabin was different. I no longer had that certainty. Her family never got access back. Not for birthdays. Not for just one afternoon. Not because Dale wanted to fish. Not because Sharon said enough time had passed. That boundary made me unpopular. I could live with that. A few months after the wedding, I went up to the cabin with some tools and finally fixed the screen door instead of doing the usual lift-and-pull trick. I also leveled the worst section of the porch and replaced one board near the railing where water had started getting in. While I was working, I found my dad's old brass key fob in the drawer where I had left it after the funeral cleanup. The little enamel fish was still chipped near the tail. For years, I had kept it attached to a spare cabin key. I took the key off. Then I put the fob in a small glass display box on the shelf beside his fishing mugs. Maybe that sounds sentimental. It probably is. But after months of hearing that I was a hall monitor with keys, I realized the key had never been the point. The cabin was small, old, and imperfect. So was the boundary around it. What changed was that I finally stopped treating that boundary like a request other people could vote down if it inconvenienced them. Brooke and I are still working on what our marriage looks like after that. I haven't promised her that counseling guarantees we stay together. She knows an apology doesn't rewind the signature on the page or erase what happened with her family. What I have promised is that I will not keep punishing her while pretending to rebuild. If I stay, it will be because she keeps choosing honesty when disappointing her family would be easier. Connor refunded the last of the late contributions. Sharon stopped calling the cabin family property, at least around anyone who might challenge her. Grace stayed with Connor. But from what I can tell, she no longer assumes his family has handled something just because he says they have. And the cabin is still mine. I didn't sell it to make a point. I didn't turn it into a rental. I didn't ban every human being from setting foot there. I just stopped confusing generosity with surrender. The last time Brooke came with me, she stood on the porch while I checked the new latch on the screen door. Her eyes went to the little glass box with my dad's old key fob inside. She didn't make a joke about keys. She didn't call the cabin ours, or her family's, or a place everyone should get to use because it happened to be available. She just said, "Your dad would probably be glad you finally fixed that door." I looked at the latch, then at the porch railing with the old notch from his tackle box. "Yeah," I said, "probably." That was the first quiet moment I had there in a long time that felt like it belonged to the cabin again, instead of the wedding that never happened there. If you like the stories, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.